welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to.
And thank you for being here today. Really appreciate it. Before we begin, I'd like to have a moment in vow of silence. Jai Baba. Again, thank you for being here today. This is such a wonderful space here, too. So my wife and I yesterday came in to check out this area here and just found it to be really wonderful area to have here to hold such an occasion. I wanted to give you a little history just about myself in terms of how my background and then how I came into this subject matter that we're going to discuss today, being contemplative dialogue. My connection with Baba goes back, and my wife's connection goes back about 45 years. In 1974, I came down here with a bunch of other young people at the time. And that was my honeymoon phase with Baba. And Mayor Baba has been focused in our lives. We brought our kids down on our vacations, and we had many wonderful times here in Baba's presence amongst Baba's lovers. For my vocation, I spent about 32 years in aerospace and manufacturing. I was an executive for United Technologies Corporation, and got to travel around the world and meet lots of different cultures and people. And my last couple years, when I left the corporation, I wanted to work for a smaller company, and I was president of a manufacturing firm, metal making machinery business, and that was a wonderful experience. And at the same time, I was fortunate enough that besides my business degrees, the company I was working for would pay for any degree that you want to go and get. And so I went to the Hartford Seminary and got a degree in religious studies. And I found that just to be really, really a wonderful and enlightening experience. And then I stayed on and did some postgraduate work, and I did work in the field of multi-faith chaplaincy. And I retired about 3 years ago from the corporate world, and then started a journey of doing some hospice chaplaincy work, and I've been doing that for the past year. When I was leading an organization, at the same time I was facilitating some small groups around spiritual subject matter. In particular, we were focused a lot on Thomas Merton's work. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk. And so we were reading his work and discussing it among small groups. And a friend of mine told me about this process called contemplative dialogue, and that how he found it to be transformational about how he engages with others and about that process of engaging with others. So I brought my leadership team in, and we did a 3-day event off-site. They called it active engagement because sometimes in the corporate world, if you put anything spiritual to it, it doesn't go over. So we called it active engagement. And I took my leadership team in, and it really had a great effect on those that participated. And we were trying to drive that down into the culture of the organization. I then attended soon after a 4-day event out in Alberta, Canada. And with the government of Canada, there was a 4-day event in this subject matter. And quite interesting, the government of Canada has considered this as a core competency within their whole business. So they've taken this active engagement training and brought it with mentors right through their whole organization. I'm currently, hello?
Hi.
I'm a student in this work. Been doing it for about 4 or 5 years, and it's something that you continuously try to practice. I'm involved in a 10-month practicum now with other participants, so we can share some of the struggles we have and the learning experiences that we have as we go along this path. I viewed this work as being spiritual work because it involves our presence. It involves our ego. And so I knew it was spiritual work. To be contemplative is spiritual work. But I also, just in the past year, really had the feeling, after reading, I don't know if you've read them, the books by Craig Ruff called Oneness. There's 8 booklets. And he talks about what we're going to talk about today to some effect. But what really struck me was Baba's words that I'll share with you in this presentation about spiritual work. What our spiritual work is in the world for his new humanity. And so you can call it whatever you want, contemplative dialogue, whatever it is, and I'm sure there's some other fine practices that inherit these same things we're going to talk about today. But it is spiritual work. It is, I believe firmly, it is Baba work. It's Baba's spiritual work as he has defined it. So I'm going to be presenting a high-level view today of this, but I wanted to tell you what my intent was in being in having this opportunity to be here with you all today. My intent is to present a practical way that may be helpful for us as lovers of Meher Baba to live a life of upholding the feeling of oneness with others in the midst of great diversity and external division. And in so doing, please, beloved Baba. That's my intent for today. Baba said a lot about harmony. But he also had, from the readings I've had, there was a lot of conflict around him too. And we all know that from our interactions with one another. And we'll talk about that, but conflict is natural. It's part of our human experience. But how do we uphold the feeling of oneness in the midst of that? The other thing is key about my intent, it has to be practical. You know, I don't want to, this practice is not like way up here, lofty. This is, when you leave here today, might there be a different way? Or just a little different awareness of how you might engage with the person that before might have gotten in your way or may not have seen things your way. Craig Ruff in his book says this quote, and I think it's really, really, it struck me, it's a really good one. He says, whenever our hearts make the affirmation of oneness, no matter what we are doing, that activity becomes elevated to spiritual work. No matter what we're doing. So Baba puts us in all of our daily life interactions. We can elevate what we're doing to spiritual work and how we engage in those situations. I want to share with you some of Baba's words. And I'm not going to read it all the way through here, but I think it's really important. Spiritual work has a natural and imperative claim on all who love humanity. The whole world is firmly established in the false idea of separateness spiritual workers have to redeem the world from the throes of imagined duality by bringing home to it the truth of the unity of all life. When you launch upon your spiritual work, you will be entering into a field of divisions that people desperately cling to, and that they accentuate and strive to perpetuate consciously or unconsciously. Mere condemnation of these divisions will not enable you to destroy them. The divisions are being nourished by separative thinking and feeling, which can yield only to the touch of love and understanding. You have to win people to the life of truth. You cannot coerce them into spirituality. The task for spiritual workers is to help me in this universal dispensation of the truth to suffering humanity. It is extremely important to remember that you can help others to gain spiritual freedom and to come out of the illusion of duality, only if you yourself do not forget this idea of unity while working for others, who are inclined to create divisions where they do not exist, and who thus allow no respite to spiritual workers. And the final is the quote that I just read to you from Craig Ruff. So those words from Baba talk about this separative thinking and divisions that we all encounter in our daily lives. I know I do. And I'm sure you do too. So I wanted to go over what our agenda is for today. I'm going to do a quick introduction of what contemplative dialogue is and it isn't, and its benefits. And then I'm just going to briefly talk about the 4 components of contemplative dialogue, and then we'll go right into the little more detail on the first 2. And then we'll take a short break. And during the short break, I just have a couple questions that if you want to turn the person to your right or left, or in a group, that you might want to reflect on. And I think it'll only be about a 10 to 15 minute break. And then we'll come back and do the last 2 components, and then summary and questions. Okay?
Excellent.
So what comes to your mind when you think of dialogue? How would you define dialogue?
2 people listening to each other, speaking and listening.
Speaking and listening. Okay. Good. Any other comments? So the counter to that of not having dialogue is people screaming at one another, that kind of thing?
Just intolerance and judgment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if they're screaming at each other, they're at least talking. What they're not doing is listening, I think.
Ah, okay.
No, you can't hear when you scream.
Good. Well, the first thing is, contemplative dialogue is not something that comes naturally, because we're conditioned to react. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. It is personal spiritual work, and it involves our whole being, being fully present, and it takes practice. It is not about winning, it's not about losing, and it's not about avoidance. It's about the ability to connect and to share meaning with others. It's not about being manipulative and defensive. It is about integrity and humility and inquiry. advocacy, and presence. And it is not always reciprocated. So it requires inner strength and patience, because you may not see the result in the other. It is not about objectifying or demonizing the other. It is about a great knowing that there is a common humanity, a oneness with everyone deep within. So what are the benefits of this? One of the benefits is, through this practice, is that it allows us the freedom to react or not to react. How many times have you reacted? How many times do we, because I'm in this, do we react right away and then later say, why did I do that so quickly? It gives us the ability to pause and to notice. You know, there's a great quote by Viktor Frankl. And as you know, Viktor Frankl was in the Holocaust. He was in the concentration camps. And he said this quote. He said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." When I heard that quote, it sent chills up my spine, because it's it's easy for me to say that in my daily thing, but for someone that was in the Holocaust, for him to say that was his freedom that they could not take away. He chose how he wanted to respond. It also can help us to see our own frame of reference compassionately, and also accept the polarity of another's position. It allows us to see our own judgments. And sometimes that's a little painful, to see our own judgments in a new light, leaving the possibility to move and beyond those judgments. And it also opens us up to recognizing the other as sacred mystery, because there may be much more to that other person than what we initially see or think. I know that's so true in my life. So how is this relevant in a polarized world? Well, polarity always exists, right? So we have hot and cold, we have thermostats, so polarity is the natural law. But when we are aware of these polarities and we're open to them within ourselves and within others, we can begin to enter into true dialogue with one another. It can help us in recognizing our common ground. It may also help us to be more vulnerable. And I know vulnerable sometimes is a bad word, something to be shied away from, but vulnerable allows us to be more open and revealing. To take risks, to move out of our own comfort zone. The other reason why I find it's so important and it's relevant is our families, our communities, our organizations, our nation is being further and further polarized. We're becoming more and more divided. And it doesn't matter which side you're on. It really doesn't. This is not a political discussion or anything else, but we become more and more divided. And what happens is that we we tend to hang out with the people who think only our way. And on top of it, social media is a great thing, but what we end up doing is going to our own social media with the people who think exactly the same way we think. And so we build a trench. And everybody in the other trench is those people, right? So we're only talking to the people who think exactly like us. And that's not I don't think that's Baba's vision of the new humanity. He knew we were different. So how can, that's why it's so important. And it's relevant too for us that have had the blessing to know of Baba, that these are Baba's words about upholding the spirit of oneness. And for those whose lives don't have any conflict, then this process can enhance your relationships with whomever your Baba has put in your path, with your spouse, with your children, grandchildren, communities, Baba organizations, wherever Baba has put you. It can enhance those relationships. It takes away, I know in my organization, even in the business world, it helps reduce all the little chattering going around the water coolers, about, because there's not an openness, there's not that straightforward openness and honesty, integrity, So people begin to wonder, what decisions are being made. So, these are the 4 components of dialogue. Number 1, and we'll go into some detail on this. Number 1 is becoming self-aware of how I make meaning and form opinions. The second is engaging with the intent to understand and to connect. And we'll spend some time on that one, because it's counter to how I think we typically enter into a conversation, especially where there's conflict. Be open and non-judgmental, and to be mindful. So those are 4 components. The first one, becoming self-aware of how we make meaning. It's all about making the unconscious conscious. And what I mean by that is that when you came here this afternoon, you probably drove your car to get here. And you walked in here. And you didn't have to really think about turning the key on the car. And you probably wonder if you hit a red light or not. I don't know. Sometimes you go, how did I even get there, right? And you certainly weren't thinking, most likely, when you put your foot on the gas and when you put your foot on the brake, it's automatic, right? That's how it's a benefit to do that, because we can have a conversation while we're driving. We can listen to the radio while we're driving, so we don't have to think about every single moment. Similarly, we unconsciously tell ourselves stories that make sense of the world around us. The problem is that these stories are based on the facts as we know and select them. So in conversations, or when some event happens, we quickly assume that our beliefs and our judgments effectively capture the real picture. The common outcome of this situation is that we heatedly debate our various ideas and assumptions, attempting to convince one another of the rightness of our viewpoints. Sound a little familiar? So it's not uncommon that we feel our beliefs represent the truth. Of course. It also seems self-apparent to us that the truth is obvious for anyone to see. I'll check that one off. This makes sense to us because we know our beliefs are based on the facts of our own experience. And while there may be many versions of facts out there, we know which ones are truly important. Chris Argus, he was a Harvard social and organizational psychologist. He developed what you see up here, the Ladder of Inference. And it's a model of how humans make meaning. It really gives us visibility to this unconscious process. He uses the image of a stepladder to represent the movement from concrete reality to increasing abstraction. Reading the ladder from its base upward helps us to see the distinct movements in this meaning-making process. And as you all know, that when you're on a ladder, the first step, it's pretty stable because it's grounded to concrete reality. But as you get up that ladder, it gets a little shaky. Similarly, as we get up the ladder in here, the ladder up to abstract, it becomes a little shaky. So this is how the ladder works. We start with concrete physical reality of the world and events around us. From this ocean of data, we selectively notice or choose particular elements. And then we add our cultural and personal meanings to what we have noticed. And those cultural and personal meanings are everything from how I was brought up in my family, the religion I was brought up, what country I was from, was I in a functional or dysfunctional family. It involves human woundedness, things that had hurt us in the past. And to use a little bit Jungian types of words, it involves even the shadow side of ourselves. But we add meaning on to what we have selected. And then we make assumptions based on the meanings we have assigned. And based on those assumptions, we form conclusions about the particular situation and those involved in it. And then these conclusions become beliefs around us. And those beliefs, what happens is, and once we have the beliefs, then it's a reflective loop. We actually look for the next thing to occur to say, yeah, see, you know, because I'm selectively noticing things. See, I know what that person is doing. I've seen this story before. Because I formed a belief and a conclusion, and now I'm going to look for it again. And then we make choices and we take actions based on those beliefs. Now the ladder it's not like it's bad. The ladder exists so we can take actions. But it's good to understand how you arrived at those beliefs and those conclusions. Because as we find out, it may be a lot different than the person sitting next to you who saw the exact same thing. So we learn to be, first to be aware of my own movement to abstraction up the ladder of inference is the beginning of awareness, of making the unconscious mechanism conscious. This process that I just described here, it happens in the blink of an eye. You don't even know it's happening. So it's important that a first awareness is recognized. when we are holding an abstract conclusion or judgment. You see, the key point here that makes me understand this even better is we do not necessarily, we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. And it's not that it's bad. It's not like it's wrong. But the way that I interpret something, based upon my own personal and cultural meanings and everything else, may not be exactly how the other person sees it. I'm going to give an example of how this thing might work, right? How I can go up the ladder real quick. And this is a hypothetical case. So I'm looking out at everybody here. Observable data is everybody here. Nice room. I see the photos, pictures of Baba. I see everyone sitting here. And I notice someone, no eye contact whatsoever. It's hypothetical, so don't worry. I'm not picking on you. Someone, no eye contact whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I see the person on their cell phone too, And boy, that's kind of rude that somebody, presenting here and the person's not even looking at me, right? And not paying attention to me. That person must not have any interest in this whatsoever. I don't know why that person even came here. As a matter of fact, when I was walking in, I remember the person kind of walked the other way when I was coming in. I tried to make eye contact with him. I'm not going to pay attention to that person because he has nothing. He doesn't really care about being here. I just went right up the ladder, just like that. And that would probably happen in a nanosecond.
How so? What do you mean?
What I mean is that process that I described happens, it happens very quickly. Unless we catch ourselves, then we can have an assumption and a conclusion that may not be correct. As a matter of fact, when I leave today, that same person comes up to me and says, Paul, I had a lot on my mind today. I've been having a lot of problems with my daughter. And my head was spinning around, and as you were talking, I was taking these notes because I wanted to understand, I might be able to engage better with my daughter. And she was texting me all during the whole thing. Two different interpretations. So you got to be careful. We have to be careful of how we're interpreting things. And I'm sure that you've all experienced something similar to that. But it happens so quick. That ladder happens in seconds. So before allowing ourselves the luxury of trusting the story we told ourselves, we should first find out whether that behavior had anything at all to do with us. This intentional practice of recognizing and testing out each step of our ladder of inference is often referred to as backing down the ladder. And learning to do that is a powerful skill in order to do that. And then combining that with the ability to walk another person down their ladder of inference is even a greater skill. How does this, any questions or comments? Does this
Wonderful.
make sense?
Any extra printout?
Oh, I think there's some down there. Yeah, we'll pass one down.
So the ability to quickly interpret the facts of the world around us allowed our ancestors to learn and respond to the natural environment. We are descendants of those who were smart enough not to be eaten by animals or starved to death in times of famine. So the ability to read a situation real quick is kind of a natural evolutionary process. And matter of fact, we tend to interpret it as a sign of intelligence and decisiveness. I can see something and, make a decision real quick. However, the fact that this ladder of abstraction operates in hidden fashion below the level of our conscious awareness gives it tremendous power for mischief.
For mischief?
For mischief. What is important is this, that each of us interprets the base reality, the first two rungs of the ladder, differently and uniquely. And unless we try to understand theirs as well as our own ladder, we are bound to have misunderstanding. Because we're not talking about the same thing. That happens a lot between spouses, I think. I know it does with Joanne and I. I thought she meant something and she didn't mean that, or vice versa, right? How do you find out? You got to ask. But if I just jump and react, we know where that goes. We don't carry the sole license on deciding reality. Again, it's not that how we interpret it and how we put on personal meaning, that's right for us. It's okay for us because that's the meaning we put on, but we can't assume that everybody has that same interpretation. And what we'll learn a little bit later is that, by explaining how I got there, and allowing for people to question that, I might learn something that I didn't need to hold that assumption. I didn't need to make that conclusion, right? Good. This is an interesting quote from Baba. The belief and opinions of a person often constitute a very superficial layer of the human psyche. They remain in one region of the mind without bringing about any radical changes in the core of personality. So, I think Baba is talking about, if I were to relate it to this, he's talking about those assumptions and those personal meaning type things that are there. Again, we do not see things as they are. We see things as we are.
As we are?
As we are. Again, if you look at that ladder, this ladder, concrete reality, and then we're putting on our own interpretation, our own assumptions. So we don't always see them. And we go right up that ladder. From the observation, the data, as we were talking about, right up until our action. And that can happen with any event. It can happen in any situation. The most dangerous thing in the world, as Zen saying, is to think you understand something. So this is a lot about, and you'll hear these words in this presentation, about being curious of the other. Genuine curiosity. How wonderful we could be curious of the other instead of judging the other.
Isn't compassion a big part of this?
Pardon?
Is compassion a big part of this? Or not?
Yeah, compassion is a big part, in particular in our stance and our pausing, that we take a deep, long, compassionate look at what's happening versus our normal behavior of reacting. But it's not easy to do that. It's not easy to do that. I'm just going to go through some of the things you can do before we move off of the ladder of inference, these are just some things that you might want to do. First of all is notice. Notice your own movement up and down the ladder, recognizing the steps. How did I get there? How did I get to that belief, that conclusion? And unpack the personal social filters that might be influencing you. Name the steps you take moving up the ladder so that others can understand your thinking. You can explain to the person how you got to that conclusion and that belief. And it may be right for you. But now you've explained it to the other person, and vice versa. Pause and invite clarification or different meanings that may add to your assumptions. And respectively explore. Learn to help someone else safely unpack their movement up and down their ladder as well. One of the things you might want to say, something like this in your own words, but when you see a major disagreement or conflict is, it's important to me that I don't misunderstand you and then think I know your experience and be mistaken. Is it okay if I ask questions sometimes to be sure I clearly understand your experience? I don't want to prove you wrong or something. It's just to be clear so we know we're talking about the same thing or not. You can have that conversation. And it may unpack many things and reveal many things that that are contrary to where you might have thought, what you might have thought. The second component is engaging with an intent to understand and connect. I found that there are particularly three options when there's conflict. The first one is, I'm just going to avoid this conversation because they just don't get it and I'm not going there with them. Right? I'm not going to do it. The second one is, I got my ammunition, I got all my facts, and I'm ready to confront, and I'll get into a shouting match and I'll prove them wrong because I got my facts and I know that I'm right. I think we all relate to that sometimes. And the third option, typical option, is, you know what, I'm going to go through the motions with you. Yeah, I got you, I hear you, yep. And I'm not listening to a word the person is saying. I'm just nodding my head and letting it go, right? This is a fourth option. And this option focuses entirely on making a connection with honesty, integrity, and openness. The focus moves to understanding with a focus on connection. And the problem with doing this is many times our natural response is to win the other over to our side. I'm going to debate my issue and I'm going to try to win you over and to let you know that, what you're saying was nice, but it's not right. And so I'm in this to win. And it's interesting that in high schools and everything, we have debate teams. We set up teams to debate. And not that a debate is a bad thing, but for trying to enter into dialogue and getting connection, you know what happens in a debate. A debate is all about I'm going to try to find a kink in your armor in what you just said so I can throw it back and say, see, that's why you're wrong, right? You're always looking for that. This is different. This is a process that's driven by curiosity, not defensiveness. And in fact, invites inquiry of another's position as well as my own. It involves a non-defended stance. I have nothing to defend, and I have nothing to prove. My intent is only to understand. And I didn't say agree. The intent is only to understand. And in that process, I'm speaking to the higher self of the other. And I'm not looking to find fault in the other's logic so that I can discredit or argue my point of view. Yeah, what do you think about that? How difficult do you think that might be to do?
Not easy, but doable.
It requires integrity. It requires telling the truth with compassion. This is where the compassion comes in. I mean, I can speak my truth. I can talk about what my values are and what my position is. But the difference here, if asked, I can tell them what's my position is or how I feel about this. But I'm not trying to impose it on the other person. And that's a big thing. So my first thing is I want to understand fully how you arrived at your belief and your conclusion or your stance or whatever it might be. And I can share mine with you, but never am I rejecting yours, nor am I trying to impose mine on you. That's a whole different way of interaction than we typically see. Certainly, good example of that is like even watching news. It doesn't matter which side you're on. You watch the news, and it's just about debates. It's about facts. It's not about any kind of connection. When one does this, when one enters with the intent to understand without any other hidden agenda, what's interesting is that I found that a connection is made. There's a connection that's made. And you can have people on the whole opposite end of the spectrum, but there's a great chance that a connection will be made. So we can walk away saying, I totally disagree with the other person, and I know they totally disagree with me. But you know what? That person gave me the respect and listened to me, and they actually were asking me questions about how I arrived there. I don't walk away the same person versus a bunch of facts, a bunch of proving each other wrong. It becomes a transformational act. I'm sure you might have done this and are doing this, but I would encourage you to try it and see what happens. Yes?
As extremely valuable as this is, it's also extremely challenging. I'm just sitting here thinking for so many years, I've been to so many workshops and so many presentations about this, basically, not in the exact format. And it's still a total challenge to do that at times. It's amazing.
Totally what?
Challenging.
Oh, yeah.
It's amazing.
It is so challenging. It is so challenging, and you'll fail 1,000 times. But each time that you go to your normal response of reacting, as long as you have that awareness of what you did, that awareness can grow. And that awareness can lead into that pause. It's all about that pause. It's about, because, and we'll talk about it later, but on the, being mindful, is that your body tells you it before you even know it. Yeah, like if someone says something that really doesn't sound right to you, you feel it in your gut first, or you feel it in your neck, or you feel it somewhere, right? So these are all warning signs. So can I pause here for a minute? Because my vein is popping out here and I'm ready to go, and I can be ready to attack, and to defend and do all that kind of thing. So how can I pause? Take a compassionate look and try to understand what that is. But you're so right that it is very hard and challenging. And that's why I think it's spiritual work. That's why the words of Baba are upholding that feeling of oneness in another. How do I speak to the higher self of the other individual?
Don Stevens
Don
called
Stevens.
it the neutral plateau, that moment where you can decide whether you want to leap ahead or not, or,
And Don Stevens talked about that.
Yeah, I think when he said about the neutral plateau, I'm sure everybody has,
Yeah,
has heard
okay.
it.
Yeah,
That moment where you can decide, or
you can decide.
put on the brakes.
Right.
Yeah.
Again, I recall the quote from Viktor Frankl, right? Between stimulus and response, there's a space. There's two quotes here. One from Teresa of St. Teresa of Avila, and I liked it. I thought it fit in, well here. We all need good counsel. Anyone guided merely by his own light follows the guidance of a fool. We all need someone else to help us along the way, to tell us the truth, to challenge us and confront us, and occasionally to shatter us. And Baba's words, to face the truth is to realize that life is one in and through its manifold manifestations. To have this understanding is to forget the limiting self in the realization of the unity of life. When we're engaging in this way, one has to forget oneself. You have to forget. You have to put it aside if you really want to engage and understand the other. It involves a lot of active listening too. I'm sure that you have been familiar with active listening. But these are some of the components of active listening, and I'll just briefly go over them. But ask probing and open-ended questions. As you're asking about, what you're essentially doing is asking them how they arrived at their ladder of inference. How did they go up to their belief, right? What were the personal meanings behind that? You see, an example I gave you, about the person not looking at me when I was talking, in the crowd. So it might have been that my personal meanings, I might have grown up in a family that when someone talks to you, you look them in the eye, you have that eye contact. But that's not true for all families, right? Maybe another culture, you put your head down, as a sign of respect. So it's my personal interpretation of that may not be applicable to the other person. So ask the open-ended questions in a non-defensive manner. Mirroring through facial expressions and gestures. You'd be like, you're doing, giving them like, are you crazy look, or are you giving them a look like, you're engaging your body language, how you're doing it. Encouraging with words and sounds and noises. Yeah. Echoing, asking for additional detail and clarification. Reflecting, taking what they're saying, reflect it back. Oh, I see. This is what you meant. And restating what the speaker said. This one I found really, really powerful. I learned in some of the chaplaincy work I was doing. I was meeting with patients, right? So I learned that inflection, the way we inflect our voice, has a tremendous impact on that patient. I'll give you an example. So say I have a patient that says to me, I'm feeling really depressed. So one way I can restate that to them, I could say, you're feeling really depressed? Or I could say, you're feeling really depressed. Same words. The first one I gave, as you can imagine, is a defensive stance. This must be wrong that I feel depressed, so I'm not going to talk about it. The other one is, it's an open invitation for that person to tell you something deeper that's within them. All in the inflection of their voice. That's all it was. And I imagine that would work good. It works good with family members and kids, and how you ask that question really makes a difference. William Butler Yeats about listening, he said this, I just came across this quote this morning. Listening is the nearest of all arts to eternity. That really struck me when I read that today.
Say that again.
Listening is the nearest of all arts to eternity. This is a quote from Discourses. To give them others a deeper point of view, or suggest to them a fruitful line of thought and action, may itself mean much more than thrusting upon them the results of your judgment.
Can you read that?
Can you say that?
To give them, others, a deeper point of view, or suggest to them a fruitful line of thought and action, may itself mean much more than thrusting upon them the results of your judgment.
Yeah.
So those are the first two components. How we make meaning and engaging with the intent to understand. Any reflections on these two questions? Jim had mentioned to me that when I talked about the pausing, that what he had learned, that the description of that would be a hook. That when someone says something that can trigger you, it's like a hook has gone in, into you.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be aware of that hook, and the way we become aware of that hook is to kind of pause before you get hooked into it. Jeff, can you bring up what you were mentioning?
Okay. I don't know how well I can explain this, but being at the center, you relate to a lot of different people, and you can't exactly get too inharmonious with the guests. But one thing, the way I kind of view this is viewing it in a different way, and that is that at any one moment we have certain samskaras going through us, and like Richie and I may have some samskaras going through me. They're not necessarily going to resonate with his samskaras at any given moment.
I don't have any.
That's why they don't
Mine are
designate
all-
everything. But the harmony doesn't come at the level of samskaras. You can kind of get an agreement there, but it's really, I feel, essence to essence. In other words, our samskaras may be in great conflict, but I can still look over at Richie and be in harmony with him. You know what I mean? But not necessarily the samskaras. I may have rap music running through my samskaras. He may have classical music going through his. And how do you where do you find a meeting place for rap music and classical music? It may not happen, but we can still look over at each other and be in essence to essence in harmony.
It can happen.
Yeah.
You have to explain it properly.
Yeah, but what I mean is that now what Paul's been talking about is ways in which, we can, even at a sanskaric level, be able to hang out together. But like I say, sometimes they just go out of phase. My sanskaras are in winter, your sanskaras are in spring. I'm feeling kind of pulled down and you're, chipper and enjoying everything. So I've had to just kind of go, not try to necessarily meet at a sanskaric level, but at the level that we find.
Yeah, I think that's a great description, Jeff, and I can relate it to this ladder of inference in terms of when I talked about personal meanings and things like that, that involves samskaras also that's in there. And when I try to engage with someone with the intent to understand them, then those samskaras are moving, mine are different than yours. But if I can be in a place where I'm engaging to understand you with all those sanskaras, then the outcome of that, in many cases, is a connection is made. You said essence is made by doing that. And that's what's really powerful about being in that space. Because I'm not arguing, I'm not defending nor arguing that, I see the world this way because of my personal meanings to the scars versus yours. I'm honoring yours, and you're honoring mine. In that is the essence of a connection that's made. So it's thank you. Any other comments?
Well, you talked about, communicating with the higher self.
Yeah.
And I think that's key. And Bob's quote about the limited self. The sanskaras, that's like the limited self level.
Yeah.
And to relate on to the higher self, to understand the limited self, it's a beautiful relationship.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have one thought.
No, please.
Just a little, it seems to me that it's important that when we're trying to do this communication and the engaging, that we are also conscious of where we're coming from, and not just on our sanskaric, but if we're talking about relating to the higher self and being able to be in that place of harmony. And yes, I do get the whole elevation of, and that it is spiritual work. Because anytime we're going soul to soul, spirit to spirit, Baba in me to the Baba in you, we're talking spiritual work. So it should always be elevated on that level. And I think that creates trust and an openness in communication. Because when you're even going through the questions, I'm sitting here thinking for a minute, how would I feel if someone just came up and wanted to ask me for my process to get to my decision about something? Because that can be an fairly invasive experience from the other side if you're trying to create harmony and you're asking the person to, tell you, why did you come to that decision? Because oftentimes that people may not be able to even verbalize that.
Yeah.
So you're asking for steps in this process that really do need, and I think we all, especially Baba people, need to start to understand that higher conscious place of spiritual connectedness. That's the place of the oneness, and it's also that springboard, I feel, for the new humanity.
Thank you. And what I heard from you also, thank you for what you said, is that there certainly is a skill and a finesse in how you ask those questions. And it has to be in the right tone, too. But if it's one of genuine curiosity, I'm really interested
Right.
in how you're coming with that conclusion. Not like
Not
how
because I'm
did you come to
different
that?
from you, and
Yeah.
I want to know where you're coming from.
Yeah,
Okay, because that is another whole class. It's called, we're dealing with that on a lot of issues right now, racially and everything else. It's not a sense of harmony. It's I'm different from you, so explain yourself. And that's not what we're.
yes.
I think if you share your own process openly and comfortably, it helps the other person want to share theirs.
Yes.
If you model it,
And-
not always,
and-
no, I
and-
know. but if
And
you
we'll
come-
get this a little bit later, but I think it's appropriate to say it now, is that when others are sharing their own, going down their own ladder, there may be dissonance within them, because their beliefs may be totally different than what resonates in them in terms of core values and everything else. So you can notice that too, that they may not be comfortable in their own skin explaining themselves. And likewise, we may not be comfortable in our own skin explaining ourselves. I mean, it goes both ways, right? So I can hold a firm position and someone asks me, "Paul, can you help me explain that a little bit better?" And as I'm explaining it, I'm coming down a little bit further in that ladder, I'm like, I don't feel right. Why am I making that conclusion? Why am I, I may not say that in front of them, but when I'm home at night, I might be thinking, what caused me to have that belief before? So it actually can be a gift that someone is walking you down the ladder. Well, there's 4 figures up here, and what do you see? What do you see in the first one?
A goblet.
A goblet.
Faces.
I'm seeing faces.
You see 2 faces.
Yeah.
2 faces.
How about the second one?
Face and a play.
It's a woman looking.
The second?
A woman looking at you.
Yeah.
And then what else? You see anything else?
Oh, now I see the woman.
A guy playing the trumpet.
Oh, yeah,
Face of a woman.
yeah. The big nose.
How about the third one?
Well,
Get the third.
the guy looking to the left, or you can see the woman.
Can you see, what do you see in the third one?
Well, you said
Also,
there's
leaning over is
You see 2 faces.
Yeah,
You're right, and mother holds baby.
ready to kiss
You see a mother holding a baby.
Really?
Yeah, I see that too.
What?
And then I see the man's face, and then I see the woman's face.
Ready to kiss each other.
You mean the fourth? What are you
The
talking
fourth.
about? No, we're not there
Oh,
yet.
okay.
We're not there yet.
I jumped to the fourth.
And how about the fourth one?
There's 2 faces and a goblet, or candlestick,
You see a candlestick
and 2 faces.
and 2 faces.
I don't see any.
Well, now I see the 2 faces. It shifts, you know.
So,
But the
can't see
third
both
is
at the
very
same
interesting
time.
because on one side it's a woman looking down.
Yeah.
On the other, the guy who thinks he is
Has
hot
a
stuff.
big nose.
yeah,
Right there.
that's what you see. Yeah.
I see it.
So it's difficult to hold opposing views together at the same time. Did you notice that? So if you're looking at one thing, you may have difficulty finding the other thing that the other person is telling you. until you let go of the one that you were looking at, right? I think that's kind of true for everyone, for most people. And even when we're able to hold them both, we hold them a little bit differently. You almost gotta, you know, in order to hold both of them, you gotta kind of let up on one, or not even look at it at all in order to see the other one. If you want to see both of them, you can't be predominant on one of them. You gotta kind of like be open for both of them, right?
But both people
Well, it doesn't
have the same opinion, and yet we see a different thing. And yet, both are correct.
Both can be correct. Yeah. So being judgmental, we're into the third component, being open and non-judgmental. Just like these pictures, if I'm judgmental, it may cause us to miss seeing the other's point of view.
Yeah.
As we are preoccupied with our own image, and we're defending and only showing our own, and only showing our own. So I close the door to any new different reality or view. When we were just here, you know, someone would say, no, I see the candlestick. I don't see the candlestick. I just see the two faces. I got to let go of the two faces in order to be able to see the candlestick. Similarly, when we're judgmental, then we're holding on to one view. And we're not allowing the other view to emerge. So the hard part about this is that you got to put aside the desire to change the other person to your point of view. And what it really involves is, it raises this question: how am I showing up in this encounter with another? Am I showing up where I have done my homework and I got my facts? And Jeff, this is what you'll see on Fox and CNN News, right? The facts are all there, and you get just people arguing and screaming at one another, and no one is engaging in any kind of dialogue. And it doesn't matter what side you're on. Because no one is choosing to even want to consider seeing another point of view. So you can show up with genuine curiosity and integrity of purpose of wanting to engage, or you can show up with a strictly defensive stance, ego.
And Paul, depending on your role and what you're doing, I mean, this is great to communicate and to do this, but there are times where it's not appropriate at all because you are trying to convince somebody of something.
Yeah. So there's different life frames that we play different roles, and sometimes we have to take certain stances, but we can communicate that, you know, that stand, you know, that position. You know, my role when I was heading up an organization, there's times where I had to make a decision, but how I communicated that and having them understand that a decision needed to be made is still in the envelope of good dialogue. It's not, we're doing this because I said we're doing it. You know, that would be an executive persona type of decision. Or we're not going to do this because I have kind of a pastoral defensive stance. I want everyone to like me, so I'm not going to do this. That's another. The pastoral stance can be a defensive stance in its own, too. So it raises the question, how am I showing up as an encounter? Have I already decided that I am right and they are wrong? But you can imagine that when you do this, it takes incredible strength and courage to explore without responding to defend your own position. This isn't easy work. It's not easy work at all. That hook can get in you real quick. Am I simply inquiring as to how they arrive at their point of view? And in that process, perhaps I can recognize some core values that we might share. It would be further down that ladder, but there might be some core values. I mean, you can take any subject, you can take immigration, right? Core values are we want security. That's a core value, right? You know, no matter what side you're on, right? How we go about doing it, you know, and you know, and my, you know, if I were to speak from my core values would be like, you know, my parents always were inclusive. You know, that was the generation. My grandfather was an immigrant. And so it's important to me that we welcome people in here. That would be mine. But I'm not throwing it on another person. But I can always speak my truth in a non-defensive manner. This is not about agreeing with the other person. You know, Jeff, your terms of sanskars and things like that. It's not agreeing necessarily with it, but at least trying to understand it. But I'm not agreeing with it. And in that process, a connection can be made. It moves from judging others to understanding a point of view and what went into that forming we were talking about and the core values. You have to pause and notice what is real in this discussion. And real can be tensions, can be frustrations. And you can see it. You can see it in yourself, and you can see it in others. So it's really important to create a small shift in how I might show up in this conversation. And sometimes you don't have, it's spontaneous, you know, and so it's a little more difficult. But if I know I'm going to be at a family gathering around the Thanksgiving table, and I know that, you know, I'm on the left side and someone else is on the far right side or whatever, how am I coming to that dinner table? Am I coming the typical way where it's going to, you know, going to be a battle? Or am I going to come in here where I'm going to try, I'm really going to try with the intent to understand and not to judge. Because we know what the other alternative is. If you go the other way.
We home early before dinner.
Yeah. And we're testing the assumptions, my own assumptions, as well as others. And when we test our own assumptions, we leave ourselves to be affected by the questions that are being asked. I may be holding on to something that's not true. It really isn't true. And so I allow myself to be affected. Or I may still feel the exact same way when I'm done with that conversation. That's okay. That's all right. You don't have to change. But you allow yourself to be affected. Take a long, loving look, holding all parties non-violently. This is not a win-lose. It's honoring the deeper self in that other person. Mayor Baba, honoring in that person. Not forcing my assumptions or experience on another, just sharing them. But this requires a non-defended stance. And it's difficult, but in a way, it's kind of fun and challenging to do. You may really surprise yourself and others. They may be wondering, what, you know, okay, I'm waiting for the hammer to come. How come it's not coming? Focus on process versus content. This is one I have to completely remember. Because when you're in a discussion, you can get into the content. You can get into, you know, all of a sudden you're into that. Well, that's not true, you know, because I heard and I read this, and that. And then you're back in. The hook has been set, and you're back in it. This is about the process. Am I engaging with the intent to understand? Am I trying to be non-judgmental? So you got to remind yourself of that. And the last one is dying to the outcome. That is a really important one. Dying to the outcome means that I don't know how this conversation is going to go. I have no idea. I am going to do my best to be in the space where I can engage with the intent to understand and be non-judgmental. I have no outcome. I have no outcome that that success means that I'm going to get a response from them, that they're going to like me, that I'm going to win this conversation and they're going to see the light. I have no outcome. I am dying to the outcome. It's a selfless act because it's all about. So sometimes people say, yeah, but the other person never, if I do that, they never responded to me at all. They didn't even ask me, what my point of view is. And the answer to that is, yep, that may happen. May happen where you're asking them and they're telling you everything. You understand, got a real good clarification about how they come with their assumptions and everything else. And not once did they ask you about, how about your views? Matter of fact, when I tried to do that, they didn't want to hear it. Right? So you leave it. But I think when they're alone at night, they think about you a little bit differently. Or there's a good possibility they think about you a little bit differently when they're alone at night. It's like, wow, I did all the talking. And they may not have this awareness, but it could be. I did all the talking, and I don't think they agreed with me. I wonder what they think. So next time I'm going to ask them. It could happen that way. So again, the smallest shift in how we show up in the conversation. Baba says, separate existence derives its being and strength by identifying itself with one opposite and contrasting itself with the other. And in the books from Craig Ruff, Oneness in the World, therefore we must try to fight the sense of separateness that exists in the world, but not by attacking those who express separateness, which only reinforces separateness that all feel, but by proclaiming and demonstrating the truth of our essential oneness. I really like Craig's words that are in that book, Oneness in the World. And I told him that. I wrote to him and told him I was going to be doing this presentation and using some of his quotes.
Okay.
Important reminder. Engaging in dialogue doesn't mean I accept or condone what I don't or can't agree with. It simply means that I pause to genuinely listen in order to begin to understand the other person's perspective. It's not about agreement. It's not about advocacy of my own position. It's not like, yeah, geez, yeah, I agree with you, I agree. No, I don't agree. I don't agree. But I have respect and I'm listening and I'm connecting. In this process, though, I allow myself to be open to be affected by the other person's point of view. The last one, we've kind of touched on a lot of it, but it's being mindful. And in order to do being mindful, of course, one needs to be present. And this requires humility and compassion and awareness. You have to notice. And in order to notice, you got to be present. You and the person you're engaging with will likely be triggered emotionally and physically. Be attentive to that, and you need to adjust. And the body has a great way of, as we said, when something doesn't appeal to you the right way, your body reacts first. You could have that sickening feeling in the stomach. You can have, tenseness in the neck. Someone said that. And you can see it in others too. So be aware of that. Watch out for when there is reaction. when you speak without thinking from the ground of emotion. Because that's the natural response to do that. As you explore more deeply, you might encounter dissonance. And when you see the dissonance, for example, you could say someone was saying something, and you could see them like tense. Now, there may be an opportunity to say, when you were talking about that, I noticed that you seem to be a little bit tense about that. And have them explore that. Because what they might be saying from their belief may not be in sync with what they really feel from their core values point of view. The most significant thing is to notice is the shift into connection. That shift in, there can be a point in time when you notice that there's a connection that's being made, or the essence is there. In the midst of all this, there's a quote from this book, Talk Matters. When we're self-aware, meaning that we're conscious and noticing our own body sensations, thoughts and emotions, we can pick up on the messages about what might be going on with others by paying attention to what's going on inside of us. This doesn't mean we understand the cause of their upset. It just means that we can recognize when they're in a state of distress. So these are the 4 components in our quick review today and discussion today. Becoming self-aware, how I make meaning, engage with intent to understand and connect, being open and non-judgmental, and being mindful. Some key reminders from our discussion today. We do not see things as they are, we see things as we are. How am I showing up in this conversation and in this encounter? Take a long, loving look. Notice. Create a space for connection. And by listening without judgment. Be curious of the other. That's kind of for me, that's an easier one, to be curious. I can choose to be genuinely curious, no matter who it is in front of me. And no matter how counter they may be to my position, I certainly can be curious about it. It doesn't cost anything to be curious, right? Other than getting out of my own way. Reduce and beware of your own blind spots, because you will uncover your own blind spots in this process. Assumptions that you made on others that may not be true. And speak to the higher self of the other, recognizing the other as sacred mystery. And tell the truth with compassion, not with forceful delivery, but with compassion. This is my truth for me. Focus on process versus content, and die to the outcome. Marcus Aurelius, one of the Roman emperors, wrote this back in 180 or something BC. Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not a truth. On one side you're seeing 4, and the other you're seeing 3. And they're arguing back and forth.
All they have to do is change positions.
Yeah. All they have to do is change positions. Right. So you got to walk the person around to show them your position. But you got to be willing to go. I'm going to end with these 2 quotes. And the first one is from Thomas Merton. He said, "The deepest level of communication is not communication, but communion. It is wordless, it is beyond words, and it is beyond speech, and it is beyond concept. Not that we discover a new unity, we discover an older unity. My dear brothers and sisters, we are already one, but we imagine that we are not. And what we have to recover is our original unity. What we have to be is what we already are." And this last quote from Baba kind of like charges me up to go and to continue this journey in this type of work. He says, if you are steadfast in one point and you desire to help my cause of awakening humanity to the soul reality and the ultimate worthwhileness of God and God alone, you will get many opportunities for spiritual work. So he gifts us with so many opportunities. And you don't have to go anywhere, just within your own circle. Take a step and you'll be able to perhaps encounter just a little bit different. And so I thank you for being here today, and I thank you for your thoughts, and I thank you for allowing me to share this with you. And I would just suggest try it. Just try it. Try it out, and you'll fail 1,000 times, but it's okay. Because each time, there is no failure, number one. There really isn't any failure. But each time you do that, as long as you have the integrity to want to know how I could have been a little more aware, a little more, to pause a little bit more. That's all that's needed. This is not like, this isn't a win-lose game. It's how can I grow more in being more present with others, recognizing and upholding Baba's words about upholding oneness with others. This is we have great opportunity to be able to do this work for him and for all of us. So with that, thank you very much. If there's any questions or comments, do you have one now, Jeff?
Well, a couple of things, I don't know. There's one quote that I kept in my wallet back in the 70s until it eventually shredded of Bob's, where he says, all differences between one another are merely superficial and cannot affect the love we feel for each other deep down. So we already love each other. So it's just removing, it's not that love grows, the love is there, it's just removing the things that make it seem that that's not the case. And the other thing I thought of is, because it has to do with harmony. I used to go to India, and Craig Ruff and I would get together and compare notes. And I would talk about all the dysfunction and disharmony at the center here, among the staff, how the things run, the staff and everything. And he would, tell me all that's happening in the trust compound, all the problems and conflicts and everything. We would just compare notes every year. So,
Nothing but trouble.
So this one time we were sitting just right outside the trust office at a little desk, and we were doing our, yearly kind of, comparing things. And Erich comes by, and he walks by and he looks down at us and he says, "What are you two guys doing?" And Craig Ruff says, "Oh, Jeff is telling me about the problems at the center." Erich looks down at me and says, "Jeff, are you still having problems?" And because I was, I felt, well, Baba wants us to have harmony, we're obviously not having harmony here. Erich says this, and as it turned out, that's the last thing Erich ever said to me, But it came from Baba through Erich into my lap. "Jeff, are you still having problems?" And I knew exactly what he meant. What he meant is, are you still having a problem with problems? And that was 15 years ago. I haven't had a problem with problems. I have problems. Life is problems, but there's also harmonious times, and there are problems and harmonious times. But I haven't had a problem with the fact that we're having problems. I just deal with them as they come up. But I mean, because I was very, like Bob was trying to push harmony, and I wouldn't say we're really even making efforts at harmony, you know? But I deal with them as they come up. But I felt, you know, very kind of responsible that we're really not living up to what Baba wants. But Baba also is one to create disharmony. You know,
Yes,
while he's telling
gives
us
us
to be
opportunity
to live in harmony.
Right.
But what I mean is that he put a different perspective on it, that just because there are conflicts doesn't mean there's anything wrong with it.
No, right.
And I was thinking that, well,
No.
that shouldn't be there. I'm
Yeah,
having a
exactly.
problem with this person, and that, you know, would bother me. Well, if I have a problem with them, I'll try to deal with it, but it's not, you know, I don't have a problem with the fact that today I've got a problem with that person.
Yeah.
So that was very helpful to me.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, and throughout today's conversation, this was not about any elimination of conflict.
Yeah.
You know, it's how do you, recognizing conflict, how do you still uphold that feeling of oneness with the other? Yeah. Because conflict is all around.
Yeah.
And there's polarities that are around, right? So, and so we live in the world of polarities, and so there needs to be that conflict between the two, right? So it's how we engage with that, how we get to that essence that you talked about. But that's a great story. Thank you, Jeff. Yes.
I wish I could tell you exactly what the circumstances were, but I just heard that there was a social experiment that dealt with one of the universities or some group of people where they flew about 500 people into an area, and these people were from all diverse type of thing. And I think it revolved around the politics, you know, which is a big item of conflict. And they put them together in a group and, you know, for a day or two, just had these people talk to one another. And at the end of the time, they asked them questions about how do you feel, et cetera. And just in using this, I'm assuming a lot of the same techniques. At the end of the time, some of them changed their ideas and some of them didn't, but they all found a harmony.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.